Hello and welcome back to the podcast. Today I have a very special guest with me and we will be talking about nutrition for happy hormones. That guest is Solaine. She is an accredited nutritionist who specializes in women's health and hormones through a holistic nutritional approach. Solaine's journey started back in 2012 when she suffered from amenorrhea, which is an absent menstrual cycle, lethargy, lack of motivation, multiple presentations of tonsillitis, and anxiety. After being prescribed the contraceptive pill for symptom control and getting very minimal results from conventional medicine, Solaine sought out natural treatment and therapies. Within 6 months, her cycle was back to normal, energy levels were increased, and her anxiety had subsided. After seeing the amazing results that nutrition and natural therapies could offer, Solaine then went on to study her bachelor degree in human nutrition. So welcome to the podcast, Solaine.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited for this conversation with you today.
Yeah, and as you know, so am I. We both specialize in hormones and gut health. So I'm super excited to share this podcast with you. It's always nice to have another professional on to be able to speak on the topic and talk about it from a different perspective as well. And I know my clients will love it as well. So super excited to have you. And to start the episode, I always start with my rapid inspiration questions. So the first one is, can you inspire us with what your superpower is?
Yes, I struggled with this question. I had to actually ask my partner. And he said that it is manifesting things. So I wish I could do it controllably, but I do have had multiple incidences where I've wanted something and then just, get a weird email from someone random giving me the exact thing that I want and things like that. So, I wish I could say that I knew how to work it, but I apparently do have a weird knack for that.
That's awesome. I think you need to look into how it works.
Yes.
For you.
Yeah.
That's a very handy tool to have. Yeah. And what's your favorite quote or mantra at the moment?
Well, it's really hard to choose just one. But at the moment, mine is you are where your attention is.
Beautiful. And we were just talking about that, in a roundabout way, how our attention can be scattered with all different things. So that's a beautiful one to bring you focused onto the topic or the task in front of you. Love it.
Yeah, definitely.
And who or what is inspiring you at the moment?
Well, at the moment, it would have to be someone that inspires me in the aspect of business, and that would be James Wedmore. We were just talking before we started recording that, I've been following him for a while, and I just love his approach to business, that it's really all about the inner game, I guess, and the degree to which you're growing yourself on the inside is the degree to which your business will follow suit and grow with you. So I just love that approach, and he's definitely very inspiring to me at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. And what does an inspired life look or feel like to you?
So hard to answer succinctly, but I think when I think about it looks and feels like, I guess it looks and feels like contribution to something outside myself. I feel like that's a really important part of being a practitioner, and really the key driver for getting into all of that is to feel that sense of contribution to something outside yourself and giving back. Definitely always learning. I think I would, I would go nuts if I wasn't constantly growing and learning. And then I think also the other really important aspect for me is close connected relationships. I don't feel the need to have heaps, but definitely the close connected ones are really important for me.
Yeah, I love that. Close connected relationships. So true. So definitely all of those 3 points that you touched on. Amazing. 100% agree. Well, to kick off this episode, I would love for you to share a little more about your nutrition practice and what you do. So you do specialize in women's hormonal health and gut health, correct? Yeah. So if you could just sort of share a little bit more about what that looks like.
Yeah. So like you said, I got into women's health really because I didn't have a cycle for 2 years after ceasing the oral contraceptive pill, and conventional medicine didn't really have anything to offer me apart from going back on the oral contraceptive pill. And they basically said, go back on the oral contraceptive pill, and when you're ready to start looking at having kids, then just go off it, and hopefully it will all be fine. And thankfully, thankfully I was like, oh, I just don't know about that. So I of course didn't do it. I went looking for answers, and I went and saw a naturopath. But basically I just thought, wow, there's this huge gap in women's health. And I did grow up with a mum who was really into alternative and natural health. So I think that's also potentially why I had that feedback from the gynecologist and kind of went, no, that doesn't actually make sense to me. And I realized that, for a lot of women who maybe don't have that sort of background in natural health growing up, that they potentially would take that advice. And I think I probably got fueled with sort of a healthy amount of rage from that experience, and realized that no, there needs to be actually more people out there like that naturopath that I went to see, talking about women's health and actually helping women to get the answers that they need. So I then went down the trajectory of wanting to either study naturopathy or nutrition, and I went with nutrition because I really love food. And I actually went and did a nutrition and dietetics degree at Griffith. So for anyone that doesn't know, that degree is very, very conventional, very science-based, which is what I wanted, but very, very sort of backwards, I guess, in a sense, very outdated information. And I essentially sort of knew that in doing that degree, I'm really just going there to get my piece of paper. But unfortunately, that I would be lacking, some other aspects of clinical knowledge and things like that. So I sort of did my own, did studies outside of university to specialize more in women's health, and did plenty of mentoring and those sorts of things. And then now today in my clinics, I'm, probably maybe 10 or so years on from that initial period of my life where I was struggling with my own hormones. I am working with women. I do work with some men, but usually it's reluctant partners that are sent to me. And my philosophy is all around initially setting up the foundation. So thinking about your sort of constructing your health or your optimal health like a house. We really want to start with those nice solid foundations. And to me, that includes real food first, sleep, mindset, and, some lifestyle pillars as well. And then I also like to incorporate testing. So once we've sorted out the foundations, then I like to look at blood testing, and that helps to inform what areas of the diet are potentially lacking, or, what areas of the digestive system are maybe not functioning optimally. So using testing, I guess, to individualize the protocol. And I do also use other forms of testing, like stool, saliva, urine, those sorts of things. But I do find that with blood testing and pathology alone, we get some really great information to start with. And then it's that natural progression from there of individualizing things. And you would know it's not ever really a straight line from point A to point B. There's lots of little changes along the road. But yeah, I find that testing is a really integral part of practice for me.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think with the lab testing, it just gives you something definitive to work with.
Yeah.
And it can also be really handy tool to mitigate some of the queries that we have about people's conditions as well, which can actually put your mind at ease. I know sometimes it's like, oh, do we test for that or not? Is it or is it not? And then when you get like a negative test, you're like, oh, damn, I spent all this money on tests and I don't even have it. But at the same time, it's like, oh, yay, I spent all this money on the test and I don't have it. So we know I don't have to treat that. Whereas you can just keep coming in and guessing and blindly treating something that you don't even have just because you're going off symptom control. So yeah, I think lab testing can be really, really important. And yeah, I definitely love to offer that to my clients as well. Of course, it's their choice whether they do or not, but definitely it's a really good path. And just another point, when you were talking about the oral contraceptive pill, I always like to tell my clients, like, if you get put on it to quote unquote balance your hormones, it's just never going to work. It's never going to balance your hormones, because it's not hormones, it's synthetic hormones. It shuts the communication between your pituitary and your brain to your ovaries. You're not actually ovulating, and the periods you're having are just breakthrough bleeds of when you go on to like the pills that aren't
the sugar pills.
The sugar pills. So it's really unfortunate that some people get told to do that.
And I think that's a sort of larger conversation around informed consent not really being there. And the sugar pills, just on a sort of side note, they actually weren't initially implemented within the oral contraceptive pill. So previously, when it was first invented, you would just take the pill all the time. You would never have a withdrawal bleed. And the feedback that drug companies got from women was that it actually feels really unnatural to not ever have a bleed, and to be just, not to be so disconnected from your cycle. And so they were like, oh, okay, we're getting this feedback. How do we sidestep this? And they invented the sugar pill and put that into the monthly cycle. So that was actually just, it serves no purpose other than to make you feel as though what you're taking is somewhat natural, which it isn't.
Exactly. And from an Ayurvedic perspective, that bleed is so important, because it's really allowing the pitta dosha to move out of our body and cleansing the whole uterus. So it has its sort of a lot of important functions as just the bleed itself, as well as obviously hormone regulation, which is sort of what I want to get onto. So we're going to be talking all about hormones today. I'm like spitting out my words. So could you please explain to our listeners the importance of our hormones, and then we'll go into some sort of simple ways we can support them. But I think let's just talk about the importance of our hormones, and from your own experience, how things like stress can affect our hormones.
Yeah, sure. So firstly, hormones affect everything in your body. So the importance of them is sort of unquantifiable, really, because
it's a broad question.
They will affect everything from, your level of concentration to how fast or slow your bowels are moving, the quality of your skin, whether or not you have acne, how well controlled your blood sugar is, if you get the hangries, if you don't, if you have really painful periods, if your cycles are regular, if they're irregular, if you can conceive, if you can't conceive, all kinds of things. Your sleep, it's all encompassing. And I think for some, we might underestimate the value, I guess, of having balanced hormones, and often not relate certain seemingly unrelated symptoms back to our hormones. But basically, they affect every single thing in your body. And then I guess from my own experience of how stress impacts hormones. So from, I guess let's start with how stress actually affects hormones. So we have two types of stress. We've got, psychological and physical forms of stress. And we also have acute stress and chronic stress. So acute stress is really, really beneficial. We need that to happen. It's what allows us to jump out of the road when a car's going to hit us, if a car's about to hit us, or it allows us to, move away from something that's like hot and going to burn us, those sorts of things. Like we need that stress response in order to survive. But chronic stress is really problematic for hormones, and that's more of that unrelenting stress. And if we classify that into two categories, that would be physical or psychological. So physical forms of stress would be, say, under eating, it would be having multiple nutrient deficiencies, it would be having chronic gut health issues, could be over exercising. They're all really broad forms of physical stress. And then the psychological forms would be, constant financial stress, bullying in the workplace, abusive relationships at home, or friendships. Those are all forms of psychological stress. And often you see people actually experiencing both at the same time, because we often form coping mechanisms and things like that, which are, a subsequent form of stress related to the sort of initial stimuli. But they're sort of the two main forms of stress, and how that affects our sex hormones, if we want to talk about those specifically, is in our brain, we've got something called the hypothalamus, and it is really the starting point for all hormones in the body. So imagine we've got estrogen and progesterone down the bottom. There are sex hormones. Up the top, we've got the hypothalamus, and then we've got the pituitary, and then we've got the thyroid, and then we've got the adrenals. So there's a nice little cascade. And when we've got issues with our, say, estrogen and progesterone, which might be resulting in PMS, painful periods, the moods, all of that kind of thing, it's often an indication of an upstream imbalance. And that generally comes back to, not always, but generally, say, the hypothalamus. And its role is really to be constantly surveying the environment for danger. And a danger is stress. It ultimately will detect whether it's psychological or physical or both. It detects that as a danger in the environment. And we need to understand that reproduction is actually not an essential function of the body. And, your body will sort of divert resources away from reproduction if it needs to be spent elsewhere, say producing all of that cortisol instead of progesterone and things like that.
I love your explanations, very clear and concise, the upstream and all that.
Yes.
And I tell my clients the same thing, like our body, it's always sort of looking for the stress response, and it doesn't differentiate the different types of stress. As you mentioned, the stress of almost being hit by a car, or being bullied by your boss, or even just rushing around trying to get the kids sorted to get to work, and then getting to work and the full inbox of your emails. Like, your adrenals are going to produce adrenaline, and with adrenaline comes cortisol. And then when we're looking at the physical side, any inflammation in the body, full stop, is a stress response in the body. So I loved your easy explanation, as the hypothalamus, the brain, is always scanning for those stresses, but we do have to understand that it doesn't differentiate between them. So we don't have a little scary dog hormone, or a hit by a car hormone, or an inbox hormone. It's the same hormone our body produces in response to those stress, which then creates an imbalance with our sex hormone. So it's always, and I'm sure you're the same, Solaine, when women come in with hormonal imbalances, we always have to sort of educate them on the stress that's going on in their lives. And what I get a lot of the time is, and I'm not that stressed, I'm just doing this, that, and the kids, this and this. And you're like, that's just become normalized now. You don't even realize that that's a stress, but your body does. And the way to really balance your hormones is doing the work and being able to somehow either mitigate or control our stress response. And that's why balancing your hormones can take a little time, because we have to learn these tools, and nutrition is a massive part of it, because not only with the psychological stress, but we've just mentioned that any inflammation in the body can cause stress. And so food, nutrition can be our biggest healer, can be our biggest medicine, or it can be our poison. So we have to, so I'd love to get more into the nutrition side of things with you as well, because obviously that's your domain. But I would, I think when we think of hormones, we think of our cycle, our menstrual cycle, or our fertility. So I'd like to sort of touch on the basics of those, and then talk about the nutrition to support that. So let's start with what roles our hormones play in our menstrual cycle. Could you give our listeners an insight into how our hormones fluctuate during the menstrual cycle and what a healthy menstrual cycle should look like?
Yes, of course. So basically let's start with what a healthy menstrual cycle should look like first. There's lots of different definitions of this, but I generally like to see that in length, it's between, say, 26 and 35 days. I have seen, some refer to 25 or even 21 days being okay, but I would typically argue that if someone's ovulating in that cycle, they're ovulating with a very, very short luteal phase, which we'll get into later. So I generally in clinic like to see it around 26 to 35 days. If it's, say, shorter than that, then I'm checking when ovulation is happening and things like that, and sort of seeing if we can work out how to elongate that a little bit. Ideally, your cycle is regular. It might be 34 days, then 33 days. That's not really a concern. It's more a concern when it's, say, 26 days, 35 days, 40 days, 7 days, 26 days. That's a bit of a red flag. In terms of duration of the cycle, anything from 3 to 7 days is fine, given that we don't want you to be bleeding heavily for 7 days. That would of course be a concern. So 3 to 7 days is ideal. And then another thing that I like to look for, ask women about, is the actual color of the blood that they're losing. So we want it to be red, ideally not brown, not any big blood clots. That's another one that we want to look for. And then in terms of premenstrual symptoms, it is normal to have some degree of fluctuation across the cycle. We don't expect you to feel the same when you're ovulating versus when you're about to get your period, but basically we want to start to make the highs not quite as high and the lows not quite as low, and start to sort of bridge that gap between those fluctuations. So you can feel that subtle fluctuation where, you do feel like staying inside and maybe not socializing as much before you get your period. But what you're not doing is unable to get out of bed, popping painkillers, and, just unable to function and work and things like that. So very different things. We still expect it to fluctuate, but not to have that really drastic contrast.
And I think you've brought up a really important point there. So thank you for bringing that up about the fluctuations being somewhat normal.
Yeah.
Our hormones are cycling. My God, why can I say today?
Cyclical. I'll say it for you.
Cycling around and around, like they are changing. We're going with the waves. So with that cyclical nature of our hormones, we are going to have a slight fluctuation. Now, what I'm getting a little bit sick of seeing on Instagram is all of these, and I quote unquote, these women health experts that really not women health experts, but put out there that if you have any symptoms, that is not normal. Your period should come and go without you even knowing. And, and I'm thinking, well, not really. Like, you're not meant to have extreme symptoms as you're talking about, absolutely, but we are going to cycle because our hormones cycle.
Yes.
As we've spoken, our hormones are chemical messengers. So they're going to tell our body different things. We're going to feel a little bit different. So I think some women are feeling a little bit defeated or doubtful with themselves because they're being told that you shouldn't feel any change throughout your cycle.
Yeah.
And that's somewhat wrong. So thank you for bringing that point up. I think it's a really important point to touch on.
Yeah, definitely. I think, even just the whole period pain conversation, even like having some period pain is also okay. It's also normal. But what's not normal is taking lots of painkillers or needing to take lots of painkillers just to make it through the day. And some clients I see are taking things like endone. I mean, that to me is a big red flag, that something is not quite right. And, like I said, we want to see these nice fluctuations, but we don't want them to be so drastic that they impact your day-to-day life. It should just be, more subtle changes. And it's interesting though, because some women that I see who have had the really awful periods that we then manage to course correct them. They then explain it like, oh, my period just showed up, because for them, it's like that after having such a horrific experience. So it can be tricky, because sometimes I have heard women explain it like that who have had that previous experience. And then in terms of the hormonal changes across the cycle, so basically we have really broadly the follicular phase, which, if we're referring to the textbook 28-day cycle, which of course only 10 to 12% of women actually have, but if we just use that as the example, the follicular phase is lasting from day 1, being the first day that you bleed, to day 14. And then around that time being ovulation, which then marks the start of your luteal phase, which would be, say, from day 15 through to day 28, the end of the luteal phase being the day before your next period. And in that first part of the cycle, it's quite a low hormone phase while you're actually menstruating and bleeding. At that start of the follicular phase, your hormones are quite low. And then gradually we start to see estrogen build before ovulation. Ovulation occurs, hopefully, and then that's actually how you start to then make progesterone. So we have a little bit of progesterone made from the adrenal glands prior to ovulation, but the bulk of it is actually made after ovulation. And that's because the follicle, which releases the egg, the event of ovulation, then reforms itself into a temporary gland, which is called the corpus luteum. And that's responsible for producing most of your progesterone. So without ovulation occurring, you don't necessarily produce the progesterone that you need to. And that's often where I see a lot of problems arise with that classic PMS picture.
Yeah, absolutely. And I always like to tell my clients that they should monitor and see how they feel when they have their period, because it can mimic how they're going to be through menopause. So as you mentioned, our hormones are at their lowest when we're menstruating. And then obviously when you go into menopause, your hormones are at their lowest. So if you're having a lot of symptoms, prior to menstruating or after menstruating, then there may be, you've got a great window to start working on your hormonal balance to minimize those symptoms. Like, as we said, yes, they're going to fluctuate slightly, but they shouldn't be causing great big symptoms that are really recognizable. And if they are, it's a really good time to start looking into those, because it's a little bit of a reflection of what could go on when you transition into menopause, with all of the symptoms that you could be getting in menopause, like the dryness, the hot flushes, the moodiness. But if you can take a control of it when you're perimenopausal and have a cycle, then it's going to be a much smoother transition.
Yes. Yep, definitely.
Yeah. So I guess we sort of touched on like PMS and what's causing it, the fluctuation in the hormones. I would love for you to talk on nutrition to support our hormones, to support a healthy cycle, minimize PMS, and also let's just start with that, and then I want to go on to seed cycling, because I find this very interesting. But let's just talk about nutrition first.
Yeah,
support a healthy cycle.
So first and foremost, which we spoke about, real foods, and eliminating, or hopefully eliminating, if not reducing, packaged and processed foods and sugar. So those inflammatory foods. I'm also going to mention seed oils in that. So things like canola, peanut, sunflower oil, things like that. Any spreadable butters, I don't think anyone should be eating those. And then within this, my first point is always to make sure that someone's not having issues with motility and that they are having healthy bowel movements every single day. Another sort of, I guess, bee in my bonnet about social media is I've seen very differing definitions of what is constipation online, where some people are describing that, or even dietitians, that going 3 times a week is considered okay. It's definitely not, just in case anyone's seen that and they're wondering. You need to be having a complete bowel movement every single day. If you are not, then it's likely that you will be recirculating estrogen through your bowels and liver. So we can go into that later, but definitely making sure that you are going to the bathroom every single day. And if you want to go and look at the Bristol stool chart, that it's ideally a type 3 or 4. And if it's not, that's where I would be starting. And if we talk about specific foods, classifying them into 3 broad categories, I would say fiber, fats, and proteins are our key, really important macronutrients for hormone balance. So fiber is going to be found in all of our non-starchy vegetables, which are all of our high water content vegetables, things like zucchinis, mushrooms, broccolis, cauliflowers, all those sorts of things. And then we've also, of course, got fiber in our more carbohydrate sort of rich vegetables, which would be things like potatoes, sweet potatoes. And of course, we've got fiber in fruits as well, and they fall into the carbohydrate category as well. So making sure that I would say you're eating, roughly 5 to 6 cups of vegetables per day. I find that's often a bit easier for people to quantify rather than saying grams of fiber, because we don't know what that means unless we're a nutritionist. But if you can sort of conceptualize it in terms of cup volumes, I would say around 5 to 6 cups per day is a great place to start, to make sure that you actually are able to bind up those hormones in your bowels, especially estrogen, and eliminate it efficiently. Fats are really important. So I would class, extra virgin olive oil, avocados, coconut oil, ghee, all those sorts of things within the fats category. And fats are really important. They form the building blocks of our hormones, and they also help with digestion as well. And then, of course, we've got our proteins, which will be things like eggs, meats as well. So we've got our animal sources, which would be beef, lamb, chicken. And then the plant-based sources, of course, are things like tofu, tempeh, and legumes. And I'd say as a starting point, you want to make sure that you're including all those sorts of things, and then looking at avoiding things like the sugars, the processed foods, the vegetable oils. And then another thing that's not necessarily a food, but I would like to mention, is alcohol. A lot of us don't actually realize the impact that alcohol has on our hormones. And it is, it has a huge effect on our hormones, which a lot of women are, devastated when I tell them that, that glass of wine that they're having every night is actually a big part of the reason why they feel like an emotional wreck before they get their period. And
can't sleep.
Or can't sleep, which is a huge problem. Or they're having lots of histamine symptoms, where they've got, hay fever and things like that. When I say that hormones, hay fever, and wine are all connected, it's like, but basically within, the 2 main pathways that will actually eliminate estrogen from the body is the liver and the gut. It's much more complicated than that, but just really broadly, the liver and the gut. And the first part of the liver metabolism is regulated by these things called CYP enzymes, and estrogen needs to go down that pathway in order to be eliminated from the body. That's step 1 in the liver. Alcohol goes down that same pathway. And if you're drinking alcohol, it's a lot more important for your body to get rid of the alcohol than it is for it to get rid of estrogen, right? And so if you're constantly using that pathway at the expense of estrogen, it's possibly going to start to build up in your body, and it's possibly going to start creating symptoms of PMS. That's something really commonly that I see anyway.
Absolutely. And it just to touch on that estrogen dominance. So it's sort of like a term thrown around a lot lately. But basically all it is the ratio of estrogen compared to progesterone. And we know that if so things like fasting or any stress on the body that could potentially prevent you from ovulation, as we spoke about, you're not going to be producing estrogen or progesterone or much of it other than what you're producing in your adrenals. And again, if you've got a lot of stress on board, then your adrenals are not going to be producing much progesterone, because they will be producing and favoring the stress hormones. And then on top of all of that, if you're not detoxifying your estrogen and moving it through the pathways, that's going to build up in your body, your blood system. So with that ratio, you've got high estrogen and you've got low progesterone. And that's how we get to this estrogen dominance, which is very quite a common occurrence sort of in like the perimenopausal type age women. And I love that you brought up histamine foods. And I find with estrogen dominance, a lot of my clients, I just sort of educate them on looking out for foods that are high in histamine, because that can trigger a lot of different sort of symptoms and responses in the body as well. Would you like just to talk on that a little bit?
Yes, definitely. So we've got histamine releasing foods and histamine containing foods. So our histamine releasing foods, the big one I see is leftovers. So the longer that we have something in the fridge as leftovers, the longer that it will have to build up that histamine. So, if you're experiencing things like hay fever is the really common one. Migraines is another common symptom. Sometimes digestive changes as well, because histamine is important for the production of stomach acids. And then also mental health things. So anxiety, having those really sort of obsessive sorts of thoughts, that's all tied into histamine. And you might find that you experience a number of these things all together, sometimes in combination with quite significant period pain, because histamine also increases something called prostaglandins, and they sort of increase all of that pain that you're experiencing at the end of the cycle. So just to give you a bit of sort of overview of the symptom picture. And if you think about why this happens, I mean, there's lots of different reasons. It's never sort of straightforward, but think about, you've got a histamine bucket in the body, and basically when it starts getting too full, you'll get that expression of symptoms. And a really simple strategy to start using is looking at where the histamine is coming in your diet and seeing if you can actually start to reduce that. So it's a really easy strategy to use. It's obviously free as well. You're not needing to take a supplement for it. And so we talked about the leftovers, which are the histamine releasing foods, and then the histamine containing foods are things like red wine, aged cheeses, any cured meats, and things like fermented foods are also really high. That's where I tend to start, is with those top things. And there are other high histamine foods like bananas and avocados and spinach and things like that. I typically start with those top aged foods first, and the leftovers, rather than getting someone to necessarily take out the avocados and the bananas and things like that first, because they obviously have a lot more health benefits than wine. But I look to start working on those first. And then, if we get some symptom resolution, but not quite all the way there, then potentially getting someone to remove all of them for a period of 30 days, and then reintroduce certain things, potentially finding their tolerance. So if I think about one client I have at the moment, she took them all out for 30 days and she was gobsmacked by the fact that she could breathe again through her nose. She'd been told for years that it was just allergies and seasonal. So she was so shocked by that. And then I said, we'll just start to test out different foods and look at re-including them. So for her, spinach is a really big trigger, and she has a handful of spinach and that's her done. And she was putting a handful of spinach in her smoothie every day. And then peanuts was another really big trigger for her. Other nuts were fine, but peanuts were definitely a trigger. And leftovers, so particularly leftover rice and potato, was a really significant trigger for her. Other things didn't really seem to have an effect. She didn't drink wine anyway. Cheeses didn't really seem to change things for her. So it is going to be really individual as well. And that's why, you can start with the easy things, but potentially removing them for a period of time also gives you the contrast to be able to tell when things are triggering you. So if you're still eating little bits of the food, sometimes it doesn't create enough contrast if we haven't pulled out the right ones to start reintroducing them. You really notice when you get a histamine response and you're like, oh my gosh, my hay fever's back.
Yeah, absolutely. And the leftovers, that's a really big sort of 101 for Ayurveda as well. So Ayurveda always suggests no to leftovers because of the decreasing prana in the food, the life force energy, but also for that sort of reason, that histamine increase in histamine response as well. And I just wanted to so for hormonal health, when we're looking at women with hormonal health, now it's a very controversial topic, this fasting, intermittent fasting.
Yes.
I always advise my clients, if they like have a hormonal imbalance, that intermittent fasting for a long period of time is not ideal, because it's another stress on the body. So I always educate my clients to have sort of 3 regular meals at regular times. And from the Ayurvedic perspective, we always like lunch to be sort of our main meal. That's when our Agni, our digestive fire, is the highest, and dinner to be sort of the smaller meal, because before bed and all of those other things. However, I know intermittent fasting is sort of a bit of a trend at the moment. And I guess for men, it works very well. And women who are not, who are quite balanced and have fine hormones, they can maybe even play around with it a little bit. I still would never suggest over a 14-hour sort of fast, and for the fast to be overnight. But what's your sort of opinion on intermittent fasting and women's hormones?
It is such a controversial topic. I always think it's really interesting, because you see so many polarizing opinions on it online, particularly with our industry. A lot of people saying, no woman should ever do it, and then a lot of other people saying, well, maybe it's okay. And so yeah, it is a really interesting topic. I think firstly, to define it is really important. So I like all my clients to fast for a minimum of 12 hours overnight. And, that is pretty easy to do. That looks like having dinner at 7 p.m. and not eating until after 7 a.m. the next day.
Sorry, I should clarify. That's exactly what Ayurveda prescribes as well. Like I would. I should have classified when I say intermittent fasting, I mean like the 16-hour plus, not eating till like lunch the next day. No, that's okay. So when we say the word fasting, I always try and like define that to my clients, say, well, you're already fasting, maybe let's try and get it to around 12 hours or whatever it is. But for me personally, as a practitioner, if I'm seeing a female client with any kinds of hormone imbalances, I say no to fasting, or it's obviously up to them, but I say, look, I wouldn't recommend it. Fasting is a form of stress for the body. It can be a positive stress, but when we're looking to balance hormones, we want to try and minimize all forms of stress. So fasting for extended periods of time is a really easy thing that we can look to change in order to reduce the burden on the body. So I am generally recommending that between 12 to 14 hours is fine to fast overnight, because, like personally, if I were to have dinner at say 6 p.m., I might not feel like eating until 8 a.m. the next day. And I don't really see an issue with women doing that, even if they do have hormonal imbalances that they're looking to rectify. And fasting much longer than that, well, like you said, it depends. If they have hormonal imbalances, I definitely am not recommending it. If they are, say, in the preconception phase or postpartum or pregnant or anything like that, again, no, we're not recommending that you do that, of course. If you are postmenopausal, then potentially looking at something like fasting would be a good thing to look at, depending on what your goals are. But generally, I don't see a need for women of reproductive age to do much longer than 14 hours anyway. If they're really interested in doing it and they have sound hormones and things are going really well and it fits their goals, then potentially yes. And if they are looking at it, then I would say no more than 2 days a week, and don't do it on consecutive days, and definitely don't do it after any high intensity training sessions. So would be my rules. Awesome. Thank you. Thanks for clarifying that. It's always a controversial topic.
It is. Yeah.
Now, And so lastly, I just would love to talk about the seed cycling, because I find that super interesting. And I know that's something that you speak about. So I would love for you to explain what it is and how it helps with hormonal balance.
Yes, yep, sure. So firstly, seed cycling is not something I ever use on its own in order to, help balance hormones. There also isn't any, great research around it, just to be clear on that. There is anecdotal evidence, but there is no sort of gold standard research on that. But we also know there's not really much money in telling people to eat seeds. There's no companies out there that are going to make money off that. So, we always need to take that into consideration with what research is available for certain strategies as well. I personally really like to use it in any clients that have hypothalamic amenorrhea. So that's complete loss of the menstrual cycle. And the reason that I like to use it with them is because I find it's a way to help get them to reconnect with that cyclical part of themselves, which when you have HA, you are really disconnected from that. Often those women are feeling like, I don't actually feel like a woman anymore. I feel like I'm so disconnected from that. I don't know what's going on with my body or my hormones. I don't even know what phase I would be in if I was menstruating. There's so much separation from that. And so I like to use it as a technique for those women, because I find that it's helpful in getting them to reconnect with that part of themselves. So I think it's more so for me a tool that I use for the mindset side of things, probably, rather than necessarily any sort of evidence-based approaches around bringing that cycle back.
Yeah.
But basically, seed cycling involves eating certain seeds at different parts in your menstrual cycle, which are shown to support optimal levels of progesterone and estrogen. So in that in that follicular phase, you're consuming linseeds and pumpkin seeds, and then in that luteal phase you're consuming sesame seeds and sunflower seeds, and you're grinding those up fresh daily so that your digestion is able to best utilize those. If you are grinding them up, I recommend definitely doing it fresh each day, so that they're not sitting in a container, not getting exposed to oxygen and oxidizing, so that you are getting those nice and fresh. But yeah, basically that's something I teach mostly to my clients with HA, and then getting them to sync the day one up with the different cycles of the moon.
Beautiful. And so the first lot of seeds are to support estrogen, and then the second lot's to support progesterone.
Yeah, correct.
Yeah, beautiful. So if you do have a cycle, that's sort of the way you want to having the seeds.
So if you already have a regular cycle, you can definitely still use that approach. You can add them to salads, smoothies, porridges, that kind of thing, and you would just start with the follicular phase at your day one, which would be the first day of your menstrual bleed.
And that would be, you said, the sunflower seeds and the linseeds? Yeah. And then
pumpkin seeds and linseeds.
Sorry, pumpkin seeds and linseeds. That's for the follicular stage for estrogen.
Yes.
And then the seeds for our progesterone enhancing are the
sunflower seeds and sesame seeds.
Sunflower and sesame seeds. Beautiful. Love that. Awesome. Yeah. Well, I have like a bucket more questions I could ask you. Like, I wanted to go into all of like the fertility and hormones, but I don't want to keep you. We have been talking for ages, and I'm sure we could talk for hours. Like, this is our passion, this, hormonal health and gut health. So I think I'll wrap it up there. I really, really appreciate you coming on, and I would love to get you back on so we can do part two. We could do like that. Hormones, nutrition for fertility. But yeah, thank you so much. You have just provided so much amazing information, and it's been a real pleasure to have you on. And I honestly really thank you from the bottom of my heart for taking this time out, because I know you're a busy woman in your clinic. So could you please share with us where the listeners could find you?
Of course, yeah. So I am most active on Instagram, and you can find me at Solaine Douglas _nutrition. Or you can just go over to my website, which is just my name, so solainedouglas.com. Or of course, you can email me at hello@solainedouglas.com.
Yay. And I will put all that in the show notes as well. So thank you so much, Solaine, for coming on. Super, super appreciate it.
No, thanks so much for having me. I've loved the conversation, and I hope your listeners get something out of it.
I'm sure they will. Thank you so much. Bye.
Thanks.